Have you ever been like digging and digging, like you're trying to get to the bottom of an idea and then
Hmm.
it hits you like, wait, what's that bottom resting on?
Right.
Like, what's the foundation of the foundation? Philosophers, they've been wrestling with this kind of thing forever. It's this whole concept of fundamentality.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of things. What are those truly basic pieces of reality? What's the absolute, bedrock?
This is heavy stuff, but don't worry, we're going to break it down. Consider this your crash course on fundamentality, and lucky for us, we've got a great roadmap, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
It's a fantastic resource. Really dives deep, into what it means for something to be like the most basic thing, the primitive element in the world.
Exactly. And we know you're busy, so we've done the hard part, sifting through all those dense philosophical arguments and pulling out the juicy bits, the key takeaways, the surprising facts.
We're aiming for those aha moments, those moments where it all clicks. And we're doing it without getting bogged down in the jargon. Whether you're a philosophy buff or just curious about the big questions, you're in the right place.
We're acting as like philosophical detectives here, trying to get to the bottom of it all. And speaking of getting to the bottom, where do we even begin? When philosophers talk about fundamentality, what's the gist?
Well, at its core, it's about figuring out what's the most basic, most primitive thing in existence. And philosophers, being philosophers, have a fancy term for it. Absolute fundamentality. It basically means ontological independence, which in simpler terms means it's ungrounded.
Ungrounded, so like it just exists without needing anything else to explain it.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
just is. Now, this connects to some other big ideas like ontological dependence, where one thing needs another thing to exist, and metaphysical grounding, which delves into the because relationship between things. But those are deep dives for another day.
Got it. So why all the fuss about this fundamental level? Why are philosophers so obsessed with finding the bottom?
A big part of it comes from our understanding of science. Think about particle physics, right?
Yeah.
There's this idea that it's unique because everything's ultimately made up of these fundamental particles.
So particle physics is trying to map out this fundamental level, the smallest building blocks.
That's the thought. Philosophers, being more general, are wondering if there's a similar fundamental level for everything, not just matter. And this leads us to another key idea, relative fundamentality. It's about recognizing that reality is kind of layered.
Layered.
Yeah, like think about it. Biochemistry relies on chemistry, which in turn relies on physics. It's a hierarchy where some things are more basic than others.
Right, like a pyramid, where the base is the most fundamental. So
Yeah.
the big question is, does this layering stop somewhere? Is there a bottom to the pyramid?
And that's where well-founding comes in. It's the idea that these chains of dependence eventually hit a stopping point, like a tree rooted in the ground. Philosophers who believe in this are called metaphysical foundationalists.
But of course, there are other schools of thought. Right.
Always. We have metaphysical infinitism, suggesting those chains never end, no bottom level. And then there's metaphysical coherentism, which proposes these chains might loop back on themselves.
Loops, like everything's interconnected and supporting each other, no clear beginning or end.
Exactly. It's more web-like view of reality. So the idea of fundamentality has two main goals, right? First, find the independent entities at the base, and second, show how that base supports everything else.
So identify the foundation and explain how it underpins the whole structure.
Precisely. And those goals are connected. If you truly have independent entities at the base, they will likely form a complete basis for everything else.
Makes sense. Now, I know we said varieties of fundamentality. What did we mean by that? It's not just one concept, is it?
No, not really. Fundamental gets thrown around a lot, both casually and in philosophical discussions. A really common way to think about it is in terms of independence. Something's fundamental in a specific way if it doesn't depend on anything else in that way, or on anything else that doesn't depend on it in that way.
Okay, so like a chair leg is fundamental to the chair's stability, but the leg itself depends on, the wood it's made of.
That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other interpretations too. Some see fundamentality as offering a complete description of reality, a theory of everything. Others view it as something primitive, something we just accept as basic, like the axioms in math.
So is there one true definition of fundamentality that ties all these views together?
That's a big debate. Even if there isn't one unified sense, it's still important to figure out if fundamental entities even exist and what role they play in our understanding of the world.
So what kinds of things could be fundamental entities? I'm picturing tiny particles, but it could be something more abstract, right?
It really depends on the philosophical framework. You could have concrete objects, like quarks, or more abstract things, like properties or even facts. And sometimes those views can be translated into each other. For instance, saying electrons have negative charge is fundamental, might be equivalent to saying the property of negative charge is fundamental.
So, different philosophers might focus on different aspects, but ultimately be talking about the same basic level of reality.
Often, yes. Now, it's important to distinguish between fundamentality as a general philosophical concept and how it's used in physics. Physics brings in extra baggage, like how theories connect to the real world and how we know things about those theories.
Right, we're trying to stay zoomed out, looking at the bigger philosophical picture.
Exactly. And we also need to separate fundamental entities within a category from the fundamentality of the category itself. Saying mass is a fundamental property is different from saying the entire category of property is fundamental.
Okay, so it's a two-level question. What's fundamental, and what kind of thing is it?
Exactly. Now, when we talk about this hierarchy of reality, there's this assumption that the dependence relations are asymmetric, transitive, and irreflexive. It's like a neat ladder, right? A depends on B, B depends on C, and so on. Nothing depends on itself.
But of course, philosophers love to question assumptions, don't they?
Always. Maybe some fundamental things do depend on each other. Or maybe the dependence isn't always transitive. It's still an open question.
So the latter might be more of a tangled web.
It's possible. Now, remember relative fundamentality. Well, the encyclopedia emphasizes its importance. It's key for establishing that hierarchy. And here's a thought. Maybe we can even define absolute fundamentality in terms of relative fundamentality.
So something's absolutely fundamental if nothing's more fundamental than it. It seems backward.
It is an interesting way to think about it. And relative fundamentality itself comes in two flavors. More fundamental than and as fundamental as. Philosophers are using the idea of grounding to try and capture both. It's a really active area of research.
Grounding the because relationship might hold the key to understanding how these different levels of reality connect.
Potentially. And some even suggest that grounding might be definable in terms of relative fundamentality. It's all incredibly interconnected. Finally, there's this link between fundamentality and concepts like naturalness from Lewis and structure from Sider.
Remind me, what was naturalness again?
Naturalness, according to Lewis, is about properties carving reality at its joints, feeling really basic. And these natural properties might seem like good candidates for fundamental entities, but they might not always match up perfectly. You could have something natural that still depends on something else in a way that makes it not fundamental.
So something can feel basic, like it should be fundamental, but it actually relies on something even deeper.
That's the point. Okay, enough general talk. Let's dive into specific conceptions. First up, absolute independence. This is a pretty hardcore criterion for fundamentality.
Okay, lay it on me. What makes something absolutely independent?
Absolute independence, or AI, says something's absolutely independent if and only if it doesn't depend on anything else through any metaphysical dependence relation. It's like the ultimate loner in the world of being.
Seriously, any dependence. That's a high bar. What kinds of dependence are we talking about?
Oh, we're talking grounding, mereological dependence, wholes and parts, realization, existential dependence, essential dependence, and even though it's debated, causal dependence.
Wow, that's comprehensive. So to be absolutely independent, something can't be caused by anything, can't be made up of parts, can't rely on anything else for its existence, its properties, its identity, nothing.
Exactly. However, there's one type of dependence most philosophers think we should probably exclude: modal dependence.
And modal dependence is.
It's about one thing's existence being necessary for another's. If we include that, almost nothing would be absolutely independent. Even a mathematical truth might be considered necessary for the existence of other abstract objects.
Right, like the concept of two exists whether or not I'm having a cup of coffee.
Exactly. So excluding modal dependence makes AI a bit more achievable. But even then, it's still a tough sell. Not many philosophers are fully on board with AI.
So what are some contenders for this absolutely independent status?
Well, God in some religious contexts is one candidate, and maybe the universe as a whole, especially if you're thinking about something like the initial state in the Big Bang Theory.
So the origin point of everything, depending on nothing prior.
It's been considered, but then, of course, you could always ask what caused that initial state. The closest philosophical view to AI is probably monism, the idea that there's only one fundamental substance in reality.
But you said AI might be too strong a criterion. Why is that?
Because a lot of things that seem pretty fundamental still have some kind of dependence. Take those mereological atoms, the smallest bits with no parts. They're independent in terms of composition, but they might depend on other things in different ways, like symmetry principles in physics.
Symmetry principles.
Yeah, symmetries are about things staying the same under certain transformations. In physics, these are connected to things like the conservation of energy. It suggests a deeper interconnectivity, even at the fundamental level.
So even a fundamental particle might be bound by some underlying universal rule.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of fundamental yet mutually grounded entities. Imagine two fundamental things that each ground the other's existence. It violates that classic independence idea.
Because they're both relying on each other in a way.
Right. This brings up the idea of non-asymmetric grounding, or even brutalism.
Brutalism.
Yeah, it's the view that some fundamental facts might just be brute facts, no further explanation. Radical brutalism says they're wholly ungrounded, while moderate brutalism says they might be partially grounded. It's saying, at some point, things just are.
So we hit a point where we can't ask why anymore. It just is.
That's the idea. Also, AI, as it's usually defined, rules out anything being self-dependent, which, depending on your philosophical system, could be a problem.
Right. Some theories might require some level of self-reference or self-grounding.
Exactly. Finally, AI has this weird implication about idlers. These are things that depend on nothing and have nothing depending on them. They technically fit AI, but they seem pretty useless and clash with theories like set theory.
So AI is interesting, but it might be a bit too rigid when we look at how reality actually works.
That's a common view. So let's move on to restricted independence. This one's a bit more nuanced.
Okay, tell me about restricted independence.
Restricted independence, or RI, acknowledges that fundamentality is probably relative to specific types of dependence. Instead of demanding independence from everything, it says something's independent if it doesn't depend on anything else in a particular way.
So we get to choose which kinds of dependence matter for defining fundamentality.
Exactly. It gives you more flexibility. A good example is grounding. You could say something's fundamental if it's ungrounded, even if it depends on other things in different ways.
Like it's not caused by anything else, but it might still be made up of parts.
Exactly. And this idea is actually quite common in philosophy. Different philosophers might focus on different dependence relations, like grounding, mereological dependence, realization, and so on.
So something could be fundamental in one sense, but not another. It's all about the specific relationship you're looking at.
Precisely. Both AI and RI have this idea of a relational underpinning for fundamental reality. But because RI is more open-ended, it's important to consider some concrete examples. The encyclopedia mentions that in the early 2000s, mereological fundamentality was a big focus.
Mereological fundamentality meaning.
It's about the part-whole relationship. So the fundamental things are the ones that can't be broken down into smaller parts. This goes way back to ancient atomism, the idea of indivisible particles.
So the original fundamental building blocks.
Exactly. But the encyclopedia points out that mereological fundamentality doesn't necessarily mean atomism. You could also be a priority monist, believing the entire universe is fundamental and its parts depend on it.
So it's not always bottom-up. It could be top-down dependence, too.
Precisely. And then we have grounding, that non-causal because relationship. Grounding-based fundamentality says the fundamental things are ungrounded and everything else is ultimately grounded in them.
So if something's fundamental in terms of grounding, there's no deeper explanation for why it is.
Exactly. It just is. And this raises a big question for RI. Should we have multiple independent notions of fundamentality, each tied to a specific dependence relation? Or should we try to find one unified definition?
Having multiple definitions of fundamental sounds like a recipe for confusion.
It definitely could get messy. And if each definition just boils down to it's independent in this way, then the word fundamental might lose its punch. Plus, different dependence relations have different logical properties. It's hard to see what would unite them under a single concept.
But if we only focus on one, like grounding, we might miss other important aspects of fundamentality.
That's the dilemma. Grounding enthusiasts often point to its unique formal features, but even those are debated. So the encyclopedia uses this, RI1 versus RI many, distinction to highlight this ongoing discussion. Ultimately, RI proponents need to explain why only certain dependence relations matter for fundamentality. Okay, time for a change of pace. Let's talk about complete minimal basis.
Okay, what's complete minimal basis all about?
It's known as CMB, and it offers a slightly different angle. Instead of focusing on what everything depends on, it focuses on what supports everything else. The fundamental entities are the building blocks that, together, determine or account for everything else in reality.
So we're trying to find the smallest possible set of things that can explain everything else, like a minimalist approach to reality.
That's the idea. The formal definition says an entity's fundamental if and only if it belongs to a group that forms a minimal, complete basis that determines everything else.
Hmm.
Minimal meaning you can't take anything away without breaking the completeness.
Okay, so no redundancy. And this word determines is pretty broad, right?
Yes, it covers the various ways those fundamental entities might give rise to higher level stuff. Grounding, composition, realization, and so on. It's about a strong connection, more than just logical necessity.
So they're not just coincidentally related, they actively shape reality.
Exactly. Now let's think about some initial issues with CMB. First, it works for both monism and pluralism. You could have one fundamental entity or many. Second, that minimality condition is super important. Otherwise, you could just say everything in the universe is fundamental, and that wouldn't tell us much. Third, there's the question of uniqueness. Could there be multiple different minimal complete bases that all lead to the same reality? That's a big open question. And then finally, you could imagine relativized versions of CMD, but the encyclopedia suggests those might run into the same problems as relativized RI.
So we're sticking with the absolute non-relativized version for now. How should we understand this complete minimal basis in practice?
A common interpretation is to see it as a minimal description of reality. It's about finding the most basic concepts and principles needed to fully capture everything.
So it's like finding the simplest recipe for the universe.
A good analogy. Now, consider a hypothetical flat world. This is a world where everything's independent, nothing depends on anything else in any of the ways we've discussed. It's like a universe of ultimate individuals.
Okay, so in this flat world, nothing's built from anything else, nothing's grounded in anything else, they're all just there.
Exactly. You might think CMB wouldn't apply here, but it kind of does. Because CMB doesn't necessarily demand that fundamental entities actively do anything. Everything in a flat world could be considered fundamental under CMB. The set of all those independent entities would be, trivially, a complete basis for that world.
So a universe of ultimate loners where everything's equally fundamental, it feels a bit odd.
It does. This has led some philosophers to propose CMB plus R, more active version. CMB plus requires the Fundamentalia to actually determine or ground something beyond themselves.
Right.
In a flat world, nothing would be fundamental under CMB plus bed.
So CMB plus is more in line with our intuition that fundamental things should be actively shaping reality.
Precisely. Another key difference between CMB and RI is how they handle metaphysical coherentism.
Remind me what coherentism was again?
It's the idea of loops of dependence, where things are mutually dependent on each other. CMB can work with this. You could have a fundamental basis with entities that depend on each other, as long as the whole set is minimal and complete. RI struggles with coherentism because it emphasizes independence.
Right, if things are in a loop, they're not truly independent in those relationships.
Exactly. The encyclopedia draws this cool analogy to a Queenian web of belief, where different beliefs support each other. Ontic structural realism, where relations might be more fundamental than objects, also fits better with CMB and coherentism. The fundamental basis might be a network of relationships that determine reality.
So the fundamental building blocks might be connections rather than things.
It's a possibility. The encyclopedia then briefly touches on different forms of coherentism, exploring how those loops might function, and it points out that a specific kind of infinitism, where the same structure repeats infinitely, could also motivate CMB. Even with no independent entities, you might still have a recurring, complete basis for reality. Okay, moving on from independence-based and basis-based approaches, we come to primitivism.
All right, what's primitivism about?
Primitivism takes a different tack. It says we can't really define absolute fundamentality. We can maybe point to it or characterize it, but not nail it down with a definition. Fine, for instance, suggests the world's intrinsic structure is fundamental.
So we just have to accept fundamental as a basic concept, like a starting point we can't break down further.
That's the gist. And this might mean absolute fundamental reality doesn't need that relational underpinning that AI and RI rely on. Primitivism also clashes with CMB, if CMB is seen as offering a definition of fundamentality.
So a primitivist might talk about a fundamental level that accounts for everything else, but they wouldn't see it as strictly definable in terms of minimality or completeness.
Exactly. The encyclopedia mentions this interesting thought experiment. Think about what God would need to create the world. It's a way to grasp this primitive fundamental level. It's the absolute minimum required for everything else to exist.
The essential ingredients, so to speak.
Precisely. And they quote Schaeffer, Descupta, and Glaser, all pointing to this idea of the primary being all that's needed. There's also this helpful illustration from Kripke talking about heat and molecular motion.
Refresh my memory on that one.
Kripke's saying that causing the molecular motion is causing the heat. The feeling of heat is something extra that requires a conscious being. For primitivism, the analogy is that the fundamental level might be enough to ground everything else, even if we don't have a precise definition of what makes it fundamental.
So we understand fundamentality not through defining it, but through how well it fits into our overall understanding of the world.
That's the approach. We'd assess it based on its simplicity, its explanatory power, how well it hangs together with our other beliefs. Of course, we need good reasons to accept a primitive concept. We can't just throw it in arbitrarily.
Now, the encyclopedia also mentions challenges to primitivism. What are some of those?
One big one comes from Schaeffer. He points out that most metaphysical theories have primitive elements. The key is what we choose as primitive. Primitivists take being absolutely fundamental as primitive. But RI proponents might argue that grounding that more fundamental than and linked to relationship is a better candidate. Schaeffer thinks defining fundamentality in terms of grounding is easier than the other way around.
So if grounding is a more basic concept than absolute fundamentality, that weakens the primitivist position.
It's one of the arguments. Another issue is what happens if there's no absolute fundamental level at all. What if reality is infinitely descending? Primitivism struggles to explain relative fundamentality in that case. RI, on the other hand, could still build a hierarchy based on its chosen dependence relation, even without a bottom level.
So RI could still tell us which level is carrying more weight, even if there's no ultimate foundation.
Exactly. Wilson offers some counter-arguments, like the idea that you could still establish a direction of priority without a bottom level, maybe using an analogy to limits in math, but that has its own issues. Another strategy is to focus on the nature of dependence relations and non-fundamental entities, hoping to get a sense of relative fundamentality even without an absolute base. So while primitivism has a certain appeal, it faces some tough questions. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's shift gears to well-foundedness.
Okay. Remind me how well-foundedness fits into all this.
Well-foundedness is about that idea of a metaphysical foundation for reality. It's this intuition that everything ultimately rests on something fundamental, avoiding infinite regress. The term comes from set theory, where it's about every subset having a minimal element.
Right, like every chain of explanation has a starting point.
Exactly. This set theoretic idea has been used by many philosophers to define metaphysical foundations. However, the encyclopedia points out that it might be too restrictive. There could be infinite chains of dependence that a foundationalist might still accept as having a foundation.
So even an infinite chain could have a grounding point, a starting point, even if it never actually reaches that point.
That's the idea. Bliss, for example, distinguishes between finite grounding chains and well-founded grounding chains, where a well-founded chain just needs to be ultimately grounded, even if it's infinitely long. This already deviates from the strict mathematical definition.
So infinite doesn't automatically mean ungrounded.
Precisely. And then we have the concept of being bounded from below. It means every subset in the chain has a lower bound, an element that's either equal to or more minimal than all the others. An infinite chain could be bounded from below, but not set theoretically well-founded because there's no minimal element that actually ends the chain.
So it's like the chain is always getting closer to a bottom level, but it never actually gets there.
That's a good way to put it. But recent work suggests even being bounded from below might be too strong a requirement for capturing the kind of foundation we're after. Dixon and Rayburn argue we need a sense of foundation that can handle even chains without a lower bound.
A foundation without a bottom, that sounds paradoxical.
It does, but the encyclopedia uses a spatial example to illustrate this. Imagine a chain of smaller and smaller regions, each grounded into subregions. This chain is infinitely long, but it could be ultimately grounded in a set of fundamental points, even though there's no smallest region in the chain itself.
So the grounding bypasses the infinite chain to connect to the fundamental level directly.
It's a way to think about it. This has led to attempts to define weaker but more metaphysically relevant notions of foundation, like full foundations or having a foundation. The core idea is that every non-fundamental entity is fully grounded in some fundamental entity or entities, even if the dependence chain is infinite and has no bottom in the traditional sense.
So metaphysical foundationalism isn't about a finite chain ending in something ungrounded. It's about everything ultimately stemming from the fundamental level, however complex the path might be.
That's the more contemporary view. It's about tracing things back to their source, even if that tracing involves infinite steps. Okay, so if well-foundedness isn't about a strict bottom level, what then is metaphysical foundationalism all about?
Okay, let's clarify what metaphysical foundationalism actually means.
At its core, metaphysical foundationalism is the view that reality has a foundation, a fundamental level. But defining that foundation is tricky, as we've seen. Historically, it was often taken for granted. The worry was that without a foundation, being would be infinitely deferred, like a never-ending story with no beginning.
If every explanation needs another explanation, where does it all end? It's the classic problem of infinite regress.
Exactly. And this foundationalist instinct is often linked to concerns about composition, especially the idea of gunk. If everything's infinitely divisible, how can composite objects even exist? It seems like their being would be constantly deferred, never fully realized.
But as we've discussed, fundamentality isn't just about composition, it's about other dependencies too, like grounding.
Exactly. And these days, there's more skepticism toward the traditional arguments for foundationalism. Some see it as more of an axiom, a guiding principle, rather than something we can definitively prove. The realization that the strict, set theoretic definition of well-foundedness is too rigid has also played a part in this shift. So nowadays, when we talk about metaphysical foundationalism, we generally mean that weaker, more inclusive definition. Every non-fundamental entity depends on some fundamental entity or entities that fully account for its being.
So it's about tracing everything back to its ultimate source, even if that path is incredibly complex and maybe even infinite.
That's a good summary. The encyclopedia then delves into Raven's attempt to clarify this using the ideas of eliminability and ineliminability. Basically, ineliminable entities are those that persist in a complete description of reality, while eliminable ones disappear because they're fully grounded in something else. And this persistence can happen in two ways, by being fundamentally ungrounded or by recurring endlessly in the dependence chain.
So even an infinitely recurring element could be considered fundamental in a way.
That's Raven's point. It expands our understanding of what can be fundamental in a foundationalist picture. Okay, now for the opposite view, metaphysical infinitism.
Okay, if foundationalism says there's a bottom, what does infinitism say?
It says there is no bottom. The chain of dependence goes on forever, no fundamental level. But remember, even the weaker versions of foundationalism we've been talking about can handle some kinds of infinite descent.
So infinitism is even more radical than just saying the chain never ends.
Exactly. It says there are non-fundamental entities that are not ultimately grounded in any fundamental reality. They're not just part of a long chain. They genuinely lack an ultimate source.
So the buck never stops. There's always another level, another explanation.
Precisely. And this infinitism comes in different flavors. You have infinite complexity, where the chain involves increasingly different kinds of entities, getting more and more complex as you go down, potentially violating the principle of sufficient reason.
It sounds like an infinitely branching tree with no roots, just constantly expanding complexity.
That's one way to picture it. But then you have boring infinite descent, where the same structure repeats infinitely, like the elephants on turtles example.
So an infinite chain, but with a repeating pattern. Does that count as infinitism, or could it be a weird kind of foundationalism?
It's debated. It offers a minimal description, but it's not clear if everything's truly accounted for. Is that repeating structure fundamental, or does it still need an explanation?
It's in a strange gray area, not quite a foundation, but not pure chaotic descent either.
Precisely. The encyclopedia also mentions Demelt's model, where particles get smaller and smaller, approaching point particles that are mathematical abstractions.
So a mathematical limit that never actually exists physically.
Right. And then there's Bond's argument, where he rejects this idea that derivative things get their being from fundamental things. He proposes indefinitely descending ground, where every fact has a ground, but there are no fundamental ungrounded facts.
So it's explanations all the way down, no starting point, just an infinite chain of because.
That's the essence of it. It directly challenges the whole idea of fundamentality as ungroundedness.
Yeah.
There's also the possibility of gunk infinite divisibility, supporting this idea of indefinitely descending ground in terms of parthood. But the encyclopedia warns that coherence in one type of dependence doesn't necessarily translate to others. So infinitism offers a radical alternative to foundationalism, and the debate between them is very much alive in philosophy.
Wow, that was an intense journey. We went through absolute and restricted independence, complete minimal basis, primitivism, well-foundedness, foundationalism, and infinitism. It's amazing how deep this rabbit hole goes.
Definitely. We've covered a lot of philosophical ground exploring how philosophers try to grapple with the most fundamental questions about reality.
And for you, our listener, hopefully this has sparked some new ways of thinking about the world and knowledge itself. I was particularly fascinated by the idea that a fundamental level might not need a bottom in the traditional sense, and how those different dependence relations really complicate things.
Absolutely. Understanding these different perspectives on fundamentality is crucial for critically examining any field of knowledge. It makes us question our assumptions and see what truly underpins our understanding.
So, as you explore your own interests and passions, consider this. What do you now think are the fundamental building blocks of that area, and what might those rest upon? It's a question that can lead to some amazing insights.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into fundamentality. We hope it's given you something to ponder.